My name is Marie Maunz. I'm from the United States. I've been teaching for, I hate to say this, but for 45 years. And on the left is my first class, and on the right is my last class. My Bergamo training for elementary in 1975, and have been going on since that time. So I guess the first question, well, my best credentials are my children. That's how I learned to teach. My son Lionel and my daughters Lydia and Lenore. And I had the opportunity to visit several beautiful Montessori schools here in the city. And this little girl, barely 3, but boy was she a worker. So Marie Montessori mentions Comenius as one of the inspirations behind her work. And I began studying the great didactic in about 1974 at the UCLA library. So on our journey today, I'd like to share with you some of the similarities of their lives, similarities in their thinking, and a comparison of 11 principles from Nature is Our Guide in the great didactic. So who was this man? You know. So he was born in what is now the Czech Republic in 1592. He was a Moravian bishop, a religious leader, and a zealous reformer of education. He was also a prolific author of international fame. In his 78 years, he spent most of his time as a destitute refugee, going from country to country. He helped to shape the education in Holland, Sweden, Prussia, Scotland, and New England. And of course, Marie Montessori, medical doctor, surgeon, teacher at University of Rome, chair of the Department of Anthropology, co-director of the Orthophrenic Center, and of course, author and founder of the Montessori method. Comenius was breaking ground that is still being broken today. And he's often called the father of modern education, and in 1942, your Czech president Masaryk gave him the title Teacher of Nations. Marie Montessori was also the recipient of international honors and was recognized throughout the world for her work. So Comenius had a very hard time in school as a child. He talks about the Latin school where he attended as the terror of boys and slaughterhouses of minds, places where a hatred of literature and books is contracted. He then went on to say, where 10 or more years are spent in learning what might be acquired in 1, and where what ought to be poured in gently is violently forced in and beaten in. So Montessori's take on all of this is that a principle of repression, that it mounts at time almost to slavery, has a firm grip on both schools and education. And she says the children who have been subjected to this kind of education are like children with broken bones who need special care if they are going to be physically fit once again. So they both had pretty grim views of education. Montessori talked about the old desks that were bolted down to the floor where the children sat there like they're pinned to the mat as they were captured as butterflies instead of the free spirits that they are. So both were born into unstable times with war-torn countries. Both of them had to flee from their native country and go to many other countries before they finally found peace. I think the thing that I admire most about both Montessori and Comenius is that they acknowledge their predecessors. When you read Comenius, you find he's always talking about the men who came before him, whose ideas he built on. Maria Montessori talked about Itard, Fégan, and Comenius, the people whose ideas she built upon. They were both prolific writers and lecturers, both mystics by nature, and had a grand vision of what education could be. They both had very wide interests and many talents and skills. Many people consider Maria Montessori's secret of childhood as being her testament. her greatest speaking of her thinking. For Comenius, his magnum opus was the great didactic. And probably most of you know these words by heart. He said, "We venture to promise a great didactic, that is to say, the whole art of teaching all things to all men. And indeed of teaching them with certainty, pleasantly, that is to say, without annoyance or aversion on the part of the teacher or the pupil." So this is a very thick book, and some of it is very hard reading, but many parts are very pleasant. And this was a woodcut from his life, so this is probably what he truly looked like. So many people assisted him to get his work published, including the Duke of Rákóczi from Transylvania and many others. He wrote The Labyrinth of the World and the Paradise of the Heart. And I was thinking about that in terms of the me and the I that Angelina was talking about yesterday. Many of his works were burned over time, and his house, I guess his place that he lived was burned. And among those things that were lost was a document where he wrote about universal wisdom that could bring peace and provide a cosmic view for mankind. Does that remind you of Montessori, the cosmic plan? So Montessori's plan for the cosmic introduction to the cosmic plan was, "Our aim, therefore, is not merely to make the child understand, and still less to force him to memorize, but to so touch his imagination as to enthuse him to his inmost core." Now I'm going to share what Marie Montessori said was a great educational secret. The secret of good teaching is to regard the child's intelligence as a fertile field in which seeds may be sown to grow under the heat of flaming imagination. Now, see what Comenius had to say. The duty of the teachers of the young, therefore, is none other than to skillfully scatter the seeds of instruction in their minds. So we're going to see that Comenius and Montessori both got a stamp. So that means you're really famous. So back in 1941-42, Maria Montessori drew this chart of what she called at that time the stages of development. Now, she broke down birth to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, as did Comenius, the exact same breakdown of ages. She even had an infant-toddler program, Comenius even had an infant-toddler program that he called the mother schools. And he gave to mothers the respect that they were truly the child's first teacher. And this was the first person who had taught this. So I got this chart from my teacher and mentor, Elizabeth Kaspari, who was at that course in India and spent 4 years with Maria Montessori in Kodaikanal in India. So Comenius was the first educator that we know of to enunciate the great truth that no matter how good schools for older children are, the early years count to set the pattern of life. And so I was mentioning the mother schools. Comenius actually wrote a book, The Informatory of the Mother School, kind of similar to The Child and the Family in Montessori's writings, right? So Comenius talks about, in a word, the eyes, the ears, the sense of touch, the mind itself are in their search for food, ever carried beyond themselves. And Montessori just says it more simply, the child is a sensorial explorer. So Maria Montessori called the children who come to us in elementary school, who have had the preschool years, children of the promise, because that foundation has been built so strong. Montessori wrote, God has given to the child a nature of his own and has fixed certain laws for his development, as much and as surely in the psychic realm as in that of the physical. Anyone who is responsible for the child's normal development should become acquainted with those laws. So they're both going down to the basic laws of development. So with this vision of what education can and should be, they both considered education as the bane of the existence of every child. So Comenius says teachers almost invariably take their pupils as they find them. They turn them, beat them, card them, comb them, drill them into certain forms, and expect them to become finished product. And if the result does not come up to their expectations, and I ask you, how could it? They are indignant, angry, and furious. So we try to make the children something, and when they're not, we get angry. That's what he's saying. And Montessori talks about the way we educate is a very simple method. The child must be made to do whatever the adult wishes. To dominate the child, to bring him into subjection, to make him obedient. This is the basis of education. So what did Comenius do? He created the first picture book for children, The Visible World in Pictures. This was the first softening influence in education for young children. And for years, it remained unparalleled. Nothing was anything like it. Now, the parallels that we're going to start examining even in more depth between Montessori and Comenius are amazing, but they're 400 years apart. So it's important to keep in mind that they live in very different times and they had different goals. So Comenius wanted to simplify and make education easier so there was more time for religion and morals, whereas Montessori wanted to develop the inner potential of the child. So they were different, but in many ways the same. So we think about the absorbent mind. Everyone understands the concept of the absorbent mind, yes? This is one of my very favorite photographs. I have thousands of pictures of children, but this one has a gentleness and a sweetness that I just love. This was taken in a school in St. Petersburg, Russia, where I taught for about 7 years. And you see this little girl with absolute executive function in action, right? She's controlling her movement. And this little boy is exploring the color mixing, and it's just so peaceful. It radiates that peace. So he's learning through doing how colors mix, just through the absorbent mind. And then Comenius talks about the absorbent mind as wax, that while the child is young, his brain can be compared to wax. It's easily impressed with what comes in through the senses. And as he gets older, it hardens. So now we're going to look more specifically at 11 principles from Nature is Our Guide in the Great Didactic and compare those principles to Montessori's thoughts. So Comenius offers 3 points to each principle. First, he gives the principle, then he gives the way teachers violate it, and then he gives the rectification. So the first principle is, in all operations of nature, development is from within. So Montessori's entire system, as we know, is based on the inner teacher. This little girl is the daughter of a friend of mine, and she has on an astronaut suit because that week she wanted to be an astronaut. Before it was a fireman, before that it was a pirate. So in my book, I've written 2 books, and the second one is Nurturing Your Child's Inner Life. I talk a lot about the ways to nurture the inner teacher within children. So I want to share a fairly lengthy quote, but it is, to me, the whole Montessori method turns on this idea that each child is unique. You go to Skinner's psychology, where it's a stimulus response. This is not what Montessori is talking about at all. So this is what Montessori wrote. There is in man a special attitude to external things which forms part of its nature and determines its character. Our attention is not arrested by all things indifferently, but by those things that are congenial to our tastes. The things which are useful to our inner life are those which arouse our interest. So she says the painter will see a preponderance of colors in the world. The musician will be attracted by sounds. It is the quality of our attention which reveals ourselves, and we manifest ourselves by our aptitudes. The little fellow on the left illustrated everything he did, and that's my son, who's now a professional artist. The little girl on the right played bells every day, and she now sings with the San Francisco Opera. So what I wanted to tell you is that over 40 years, I have seen children who were the friends of my children grow up, and the lessons that they were attracted to in early childhood is the path they've chosen in their lives. It's consistent. So this all goes to Comenius' principle that development comes from within. Bottom line is, we don't want to force children to do those things that they're not interested in doing. And we want to understand, let thy words be few. So children need to understand things by doing, then they need to remember them. The second thing we do is give vocabulary. And Comenius says no written or oral evaluations may be done until the first two steps are completed. So let's compare this to the 3-period lesson. This is, the child is getting an understanding of this sense, of this experience. Show me, remember it, and then what is this? The evaluation. You know, when parents and educators in traditional systems ask how we can succeed in Montessori without testing, we simply say, well, we test every time we give a presentation when we do a 3-period lesson. We know if they know it. We don't have to test them. Okay, now we go to the second principle. Nature in its formative processes begins with the universal and ends with the particular. So he says something that's the forerunner of the cosmic plan. It is a mistake to teach the several branches of science in detail before a general outline of the whole realm of knowledge is placed before the students. He said that 400 years ago. So, here we go. In Montessori, what do we give first in the elementary program? A view of the whole. So for those of you who are familiar with elementary, you would just know that the cosmic plan involves history, geography, and biology. And then with that as your core, then you read, you do numbers, and you bring everything in one unified whole for the child's vision. So the third principle, nature carefully avoids obstacles and things likely to cause hurt. So Comenius uses the example of the mother bird. She lays her eggs in a very warm, protected nest where cold rains and wind are kept away. So he says the deviation from this is when we introduce material that's too confusing to children, we endanger their thinking and their understanding. So he advises that only material that's suitable for the mind of the child be introduced to the child. Developmentally appropriate practice in the 1500s, right? So we can take for the example, teaching a child to read or assisting a child on the pathway to become a reader. The way it's taught in traditional situations confuses children. And the conclusion of rectifying this is isolation of difficulty. It's very simple. So children learn to control their movements and develop their pincher grip with the, all kinds of different sensorial materials and practical life materials. They do mental insets, the beginning sounds, and learning to segment and blend a word into its parts. They become master of letters, then they word build with a movable alphabet, they write, they read. It's all separate steps for them, nothing overwhelming. So our task is to remove the obstacles from the children. And Montessori said it so beautifully, everything we do for the child that he can do for himself is an obstacle to his development. I attended the seminar on aging and dementia the other day, and this exact same principle holds with elders. Everything that you do for them that they can do for themselves takes something away from them. So as we avoid obstacles, we protect the spiritual embryo within the child. Among the most difficult problems we face is the prejudice of adults. We don't understand what the child needs mentally and spiritually. Montessori talked about when she was a young doctor, they finally understood that washing hands would prevent the spread of disease. She says there is a parallel in the mental and spiritual realm of hygiene, of meeting the needs of children. And when we really understand that and do that, many of the deviations we see will disappear. So the fourth principle is nature begins by a careful selection of materials. And Comenius talks about purity and clarity. So we can examine that in terms of the environment, and the preparation of the teacher. So we can have beautiful prepared environments that are suited for the child. And so we see in the upper left, it's Bozeman, Montana, Seoul, Korea. I think it's an interesting thing that although Montessori talks about the spiritual preparation of the teacher, it's something that each one of us has to grapple with ourselves. Hopefully our training takes us through some kind of a process of working with our psychology, because that is our biggest hurdle, our own psychology. A friend of mine told me a very good word of advice one time. She said, when you get to the door of your classroom, just take off your stuff, because rest assured it will be there when you come back. Because we have no right to impose our own burdens on those precious children who come to us to be. So the fifth principle is nature prepares its material so that it actually strives to attain its normal, natural form.
Pátý princip je, že přirozenost si vlastně připravuje svůj vlastní materiál, který je připraven získat svoji formu.
And Comenius writes in such a lyrical way. He says, thus the chicken and the egg, when sufficiently formed, seeks to develop itself still further, moves and bursts the shell or breaks through it with its beak. After escaping from its prison, it takes pleasure in the wealth and nutriment provided by its mother, opening its beak expectantly and swallows its food greedily. It rejoices to find itself under the open sky, exercises its wings, and later on uses them with enjoyment, almost at a point of crystallization, around which, provided there be homogeneous material and an undisturbed environment, the definitive form of the child. And this is why we don't interrupt a child who's focused, because he's forming something, and if we interrupt him, that might just kind of dissolve and shatter. It's like, think about making a crystal in supersaturated solution. You stick a string down there and watch it. If you pick that jar up and shake it, you have to start all over again. So Comenius says those who drive the boys to their studies do them great harm, because we're not allowing that crystal to form. And he points out, if you force a child to eat when he's not hungry, you can actually make him sick. What do we do to their minds? But when a person is hungry and wants to learn, they're going to take it in and gain greatly. So Montessori's analogy to this is the story of a thirsty man. So imagine you're walking across a desert and you're very, very thirsty. And you see someone with a pitcher of water, and he gives you a lesson on how to pour water. And he shows you how to drink. Are you satisfied? You need to drink yourself to your own satisfaction. So she said this is basically what we do to children when we stand up on the board and teach them a lesson and tell them. We're leaving them hungry and thirsty because they need to do it and experience it. So Montessori's quote is here for those of you who can read it. I won't take the time to read it because it's kind of long, but you got the idea. I do have to say, she says, this fact that the child needs to experience on his own is the basis of all psychological or psychic construction and the sole secret of education. So she says the external object that the child works on in the classroom, our materials, are the gymnasium of the spirit. And such exercises are primarily the aim of the action, this inner satisfaction. She said thus, the solid insets are not designed or intended to give the child a knowledge of dimensions, nor are the plain insets designed to give him a conception of form. The purpose, as with all the other objects in the classroom, is to make the child exercise his own inner activities. I hope you all understand this point, because this is so important. It's the child developing himself, not that he learns to read and write and do math. Although those are icing on the cake, as we say in English. So I think we don't ever have to make children learn. We can think learning is to the brain as breathing is to the lungs, as beating is to the heart. So the sixth principle, nature develops everything from beginnings, which though insignificant in appearance, possess great potential. Montessori says almost exactly the same thing. Our newborn children, when we hold them in their arms, they're so small and weak, but yet the power to construct an individual is there. That power is nowhere else in the universe. So it may be insignificant, but it's power. So Comenius says the problem is most teachers want to plant whole trees instead of seeds and trees instead of shoots. So he says, to simplify it, let's make everything short and clear, bottom line. So let's take a look in Montessori at addition. All the ways we can make it simple and clear and precise. So we can do the numerical rods, combinations to make 10. We do the snake game of combinations to make 10. We do the decimal system to do addition. We then do beadwork for addition, then we do the tables, then we do the strip boards, then we do the memorization charts, all to make the simple facts of addition clear to the child. So I think it's very interesting what Montessori wrote in 1931. What needs to be known is how little we need to teach. However, it must be taught in an absolutely exact manner, especially when a conventional rule has already been established, as in math. So Comenius explains that everything develops according to a preordained pattern. So an acorn from an oak tree can only become an acorn. No other tree will grow from an acorn. Then he explains exactly the same thing Montessori says later on. Development takes place at the expense of the environment. The child internalizes the environment and develops himself out of that environment. Montessori calls it mental chemistry. So here's a little fellow, his name is Adam, and he's working with the botany cabinet, as you can see. And after he had done the sensorial work, he learned the names of the leaves. And one day, Adam was walking out his front door, and he looked at the leaves on the bush that he'd seen every day of his life, and he reached a point of consciousness. That's an ovate leaf! So principle 7, nature advances from what is easy to what is more difficult. And Comenius uses the example of a seashell that starts with the soft interior part and then hardens into a shell. And then he says it's wrong to teach the unknown through the medium of what is equally unknown. You want to start with something the child knows and take him the next step. And of course, take a look at the seed of the study of multiples. It's just the multiplication chain. It's the child is seeing and experiencing without even knowing the concept of multiples. The prepared environment in each one of the avenues goes from the more simple to the more complex. So we see a child who's pouring and then pouring through a funnel and then doing table washing, all with water. And Montessori talks about that moment when the child moves from using the material to he doesn't need it anymore. So she said at a certain age of maturity, he desires to reason in the abstract, as if obeying an internal impulse to move forward. And she says this internal impulse liberates the soul and at the same time affects an economy of time. It's quicker to do it in your head. So here's a little girl that's learning the commutative principle or property with 4 times 6 is the same as 6 times 4. So I think the important thing is that we realize the continuum from easy to hard has to be directed by the inner teacher, not by the teacher and a curriculum of ages. So the 8th principle is nature does not hurry, but advances slowly. And he uses the example, he says, the mother bird does not take her eggs into a fire to heat them up so they'll hatch faster. She allows them to mature under the warmth of her body. Then he says something that could be speaking to us today. Been in a Montessori classroom where you see the teachers, where's your next lesson? What work are you going to do next? Instead of allowing that time to take it in and contemplate. The 9th principle, nature compels nothing to advance that is not driven forward by its own to her strength. And again, he goes back to the analogy of the chicken. And the chick is not compelled to leave the egg before its organs and limbs are ready to support it. Likewise, it's not forced to fly until its feathers have grown. And so we want to remember that the child has within himself a principle that compels him forward at his own rate. So she says, help me to do it all by myself. 10th principle, Rome. Nature assists its operations in every possible manner. So he says that the deviation is the cruelty of a teacher who expects a child to succeed at a task before showing him how to do it. And after the child fails, the teacher gets angry at him. So think back, and maybe the way you were taught or at schools you've visited, how many times do teachers begin a lesson by asking the children questions? Mm-hmm. And if the children don't know the answer, what if they shut down? They don't know. They're already failed before the teacher even opens her mouth to teach. So the rectification, of course, is again the 3-period lesson. This is what we do. This is how you do it. Like she says, when a guest walks in, the children know how to greet a guest, but they're not forced to do it unless if they're concentrated on their work, they don't have to do it. And one of the things that Comenius says is that it is torture to put a child in a classroom at a certain age and expect him to do the work whether he knows how to do it or not. And isn't that what we do in traditional education every day? He says nature's way is very different, and it teaches us to have patience with the weak. Every child can learn. He says, if it be urged that some men have such weak intellects that it is not possible for them to acquire knowledge, I answer, it is scarcely possible to find a mirror that is so dulled that it will not reflect an image of some kind. And we know that Montessori teaches us to see the child that is not yet there. She began herself with children who were developmentally delayed, and she took them to sit for the state exams in Rome, which they passed above and beyond many of the normal children. And this led to her essential question, what's wrong with normal education? So Montessori describes a path of learning. And you've got the child who walks along that path just happy and content to move along. And then you've got the gallopers, the ones who are racing through ahead of their group and happy to be learning everything. It's the same path of education for all, but it's just a matter of how fast. I picked up a copy of Montessori's talks to parents yesterday, and I was reading it in my room last night, and this is one of the chapters. She talks exactly about this. So nature assists us to really redefine education. Education is help to life. It is not a curriculum of this child must to learn this year, and this year, and this the next year, much as our state testing systems would like us to believe. The 11th principle is nothing is produced by nature of which the practical application is not soon evident. So with a bird, the wings are for flying, the legs are for walking. So this is showing one of my students in St. Petersburg working with geometric insets. Now this teacher is going to become very adept at doing it, but she'll never be as adept as the 3- and 4-year-old. So one day, a little 4-year-old Montessori child was walking to school with her daddy, who was an engineer at a big corporation. And they're walking past a construction site, and they see a worker carrying a window to place into a house. And the little girl says, "Daddy, that window's not going to fit." And he said, "Well, of course it is. They've measured it. Everything is just going to be just so." And she says, "No, it's too small, Daddy." So they argued back and forth for a few minutes, and then the dad agreed, "Let's just stay and watch." So this little girl who had been doing this lesson, guess who was right? So we have extensions of practical life and sensorial. For example, you do all these beautiful color tablets, and then you find something that the pink in your shirt is just exactly like my tablet. And so then, we're actually doing things with what we're learning. I want to talk just a moment about vocabulary and naming things. This man, Alexander Luria, is one of my favorite psychologists. He was a Russian, a colleague of Vygotsky, and he spent some time in Siberia with very uneducated groups of people. And he discovered a very interesting if he taught them the word circle, they suddenly began to realize that the wheels on the wagon were circles, the plates that their food was on were circles. Before that time, they had no concept of that single thing of circularity. And so there is amazing research in the United States, and I think it's international in scope, that people who come from very uneducated families tend to have a very low vocabulary compared to the children of college-educated people, and it never gets compensated for. So essentially, the more words we can give to children, the more concepts they have in their minds. And there is a researcher in the United States at the University of Virginia who basically, after many, many years of studying vocabulary, he said, vocabulary is the #1 predictor of upward mobility. So I think we find that Montessori brought Comenius' principles into greater focus. Montessori said those working in education who have managed to arouse interest that leads to action performed with all one's efforts and effective enthusiasm have succeeded in awakening the man within. And man, with his interest and energy arises, can do things that we do not expect. So this little girl is 6 years old, and she's doing polynomial addition without any difficulty whatsoever. So we have talked this afternoon about two great educators. Both believed that education was the birthright of every child, whether girl or boy. Both of them understood that our guide is in nature, and that the great power of life resides within the child. You know, this picture was my very first experience of a mass desire to do one lesson. These kids did maths every day, all day, for 2.5 weeks. So I'd heard about sensitive periods, but I'd never seen one quite like this, and I had to defend the children against the parents who said, where is their math? Where is their reading? So Montessori said, if we consider the child as the cornerstone of education, and if guidance lies in the choice made by the child rather than the teacher's logic, brand new principles are necessarily brought into education. So Jana Amose Komenského was a man with a great, great vision. Marie Montessori was a woman with a grand vision and the means to implement it. So it is almost as though one soul has taken the work of another soul and taken it further and refined it. But every idea that's in Montessori's books is there in Comenius. So it has been my honor to be here with you today.